Welcome to You Don't Know Ball. Today we are with Nick from the Philly Film Room. We're going to be talking Eagles. Nick, how you doing today?
Oh man, fantastic. It's always a great day to talk Eagles football, so I'm ready to get started.
All right, as always, if you don't know ball and want to know ball, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, let us know in the comments what you think the Eagles' record will be this year. To kind of start it off, Nick, how much faith do you have in the Eagles fan base, or does the Eagles fan base still have kind of Nick Sirianni after last year?
Yeah, I think the fan base is a little split on the whole Nick Sirianni side of the coin. There's a side where they saw that the Eagles went and got rid of their coordinators and brought in a new group of coaches that are very experienced. You know, our last group of coaches of coordinators were first-time coordinators or only had 1 year of experience as a coordinator in the NFL. And now they go in and they bring Vic Fangio, who you're going to be hard pressed to find anyone that has more experience at any level of coaching than Vic Fangio. And then also you have Kellen Moore, who's been an offensive coordinator for, I believe, 6 years now, and he's been very successful in his role. So I think a lot of people saw that Nick kind of was a little stubborn in some of the stuff that they did last year, and he's shown that he wants to make some changes by bringing in Kellen Moore, by kind of letting go of control of the offense a little bit. And hopefully that allows him to grow and continue to become a better coach. And personally, I think that he should have stayed on as long as he was willing to let go of some of that control of the offense. He is a guy that the players believed in, and he was able to rally them. I think he is a good teacher. Now, I think his schemes got a little bit stale. They tried to run back to almost the same exact offense from their Super Bowl run, at which teams just adjusted at that point in time. They had a whole offseason to look at what the Eagles did as an offense, and they kind of adjusted. And Sirianni said coming into last season and training camp that they weren't adding anything new. They were just going to get better at what they were already good at. And that just didn't work out too well. So obviously he's given up some of that control, but you also have other people on the flip side that say, if he's just going to be a player's coach, he's not has no control over calling plays or anything like that, then why is he there? And then you also have the point that if Kellen Moore does have a great year, well, it's very, very likely that they're going to be looking for a new offense coordinator again next year. So I see both sides. I would say as the offseason has gone on, I think a lot of people are getting back on board with Nick Sirianni again, rightfully so. But only time will tell if they made the right move bringing him back.
Yeah, I mean, with the way that the Philly defense is constructed, bringing in a guy like Vic Fangio, personally, like me as a Bears fan, getting to watch that 2018 season where you guys ultimately crushed our dreams in the playoffs, but he is just honestly like one of the best people in the game. And I know like he had that year with Miami where it just was kind of all over the place, but to me that really didn't feel like a fit anyway when he went to Miami. I think Philadelphia fits him a lot more, and I'm excited to see what he can do with that defense, especially with the upgraded secondary that they were able to bring in. But kind of going off your point, like with the being like a player's coach, in terms of Nick Sirianni, I think sometimes you need that though. Like you see a lot of these older coaches in the league that just can't connect with their players, and I mean, unfortunately, I think that's why Bill Belichick kind of was out the door. Obviously, there's larger issues in New England, but when you just run things the same way, that, the old school way, like that doesn't work with a lot of the players now that are in the league. Like these are young guys that are kind of like our age. Like I'm 25, so, seeing the way that these coaches, I mean, Sean McVay was the start of it, obviously, and I'm just rambling at this point, but if you can't
No, I
get a
think you have
guy
it.
that's going to motivate your team the right way, they're not going to play their best.
Yeah, and I think you have a good point about that. And, that was part of the reason why Vic Fangio didn't work out in Miami. If you look at what a number of players had to say after he left the door or left the club, Vic Fangio kind of had that issue connecting with some of those younger players. But I think that's where he fits in well with the Eagles, in that Nick can kind of balance that out as a younger coach, and Kellen's a younger coach as well. So I think having that mix right there is really going to help. And also for guys like Vic Fangio, he did struggle to connect with his players down in Miami, but they had a pretty it was a lot of veterans on that defense that kind of have been around the block and kind of have a certain way of wanting to do things. This Eagles defense has kind of retooled and gotten a lot younger at a lot of positions, and I think they'll be more susceptible to the influences of what Fangio's trying to do, as opposed to some of the guys in Miami who now are asked to play a different style of ball than they used to play. But you're exactly right. I mean, you got to be able to connect with your players. It's huge. A lot of people overlook how much of coaching is connecting with people, and that's something that I think Sirianni is good with.
No, absolutely. And I think so that would then this is a great transition, Nick, to the next question I wanted to ask is, and again, I think we kind of already touched on it, but like just to glaze back over it, maybe if you had more of a personal outlook on it. If you had to pinpoint the biggest issue from last season, what are you going to say was the biggest issue of why the Eagles didn't reach that same success they did from the year prior?
Yeah, I think you can kind of split it up looking at offense and defense. So I'll kind of pinpoint both. I think I kind of touched on offense already, just that they kind of ran the same scheme back. They made hardly any adjustments. I could go through and do 10-minute clips of them running the same exact concepts from 2022 to 2023, and they just never adjusted. Their biggest issue on offense really was handling, big blitzes. So cover zero, six-man pressures, any type of overload pressure that they sent, the Eagles had no answer for. And that really derailed their offense because they would get into third and long, or when they did get into third and long, teams just started blitzing the hell out of them, and they had no answer for it. So I think bringing in Kellen Moore, his offenses have fared much better against zero blitzes. Now, a lot of that is on the quarterback as well, but I think Moore should be able to help coach Jalen up in those situations and have a better scheme as well. Defensively, a lot of it was, I think it's a mix of a number of things. One was, I think they just didn't have the talent to be a top tier defense, especially when you look at the back seven. They didn't really have, if you look at the back seven, their defense, they didn't really have anyone that you would consider an impact player. You had some guys that were good B-level players, but if you have a lot of B-level players and then mix in some C-level and below players, it's kind of hard to make those impact plays that change and flip football games. I think we all know that football comes down to a handful of plays a game, and when you don't have that on the back end, just in terms of the talent level, you're kind of missing out, and that's when you lose some of those close games. But where things really went downhill is there was some issue going on with their coaching staff on the defensive side of the ball. A lot of the players didn't. It sounded like half the team believed in the first defensive coordinator we used, and Sean Desai, and half the players didn't believe in him. And then so you get a coaching change mid-season, and it just got worse from there. Communication issues across the board. If you want to see a perfect example of that, there's a play against the Cardinals where the entire pre-snap, it's like 20 seconds of the all 22 film. You have 6 different players all communicating, yelling at each other. No, you go here. No, you go here. And it's just, it looked like it was like a JV team out there. And this is like it was like week 17 of the NFL season. And so when you can't communicate, it leads to a lot of issues on defense. And I think those were probably the biggest issues.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that very much. It was definitely well documented last year and everything. The defensive coordinator switch midseason was definitely not even a head scratcher because you like it made sense from the perspective of they wanted to get back to that same like standard from the year before, and they thought maybe bringing Patricia over was going to be the move. But again, it obviously didn't work out, and we're at now. But I think again, you guys are on a much better trajectory now, much more faith in the coaching staff, and that's all you can do after you have a year like that.
Yeah, and if
Yeah,
you want to talk
definitely.
about
Okay.
connecting with your players, Patricia is probably the last guy you want to, talk about. Now,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean that's the reason we have Darius Slay is because Patricia ran him out of Detroit, And
Yeah.
one thing that I thought was extremely interesting when I go back and look at the splits from the Eagles defense last year, they were actually a solid defense on first and second down for the majority of the year. They played a ton of zone coverage on first and second down. They were either first or second and man coverage on third down though, and they were horrible at it. They just did not have the guys to match up in man coverage. Now, I think there was a kind of Patricia was on the defensive staff the whole season. I think there was kind of some a breakdown and some influence of Patricia leading up even before he became the defensive coordinator midway through the season, because if you look at Patricia's tree where he comes from the Patriots, they run a ton of man coverage. And it was like we ran the Desai Fangio defense on first and second downs. And then on third downs, we ran the Patriots defense. And that's like that's the key right there. A perfect example of the communication, not even across player to player, but across the coaching staff of how they couldn't get on the same page. So
Yeah,
Oh, that's a great example too.
you could definitely see like the disconnect, and I think obviously we'll get to it in a little bit, but just like Philly did really target the defensive back room quite a bit to get that type of player in there, regardless if you're going to be running that scheme. In terms of like the Patriot defense, it's going to be more Fangio, obviously, as he's the DC. But moving over to kind of the offensive side of the ball at this point, if you look at the numbers between Jalen Hurts' season last year and the year before, I think the numbers are like how people view the performance compared to when you look at the numbers is a little bit different, because passing wise, it was very similar. The interceptions were up for sure, but do you think this year, kind of getting A.J. Brown extended, getting Devontae Smith extended, bringing in Kellen Moore, do you think there's a chance that Jalen Hurts can kind of jump his 2022, 2023 production?
absolutely. And the thing you see with Jalen Hurts is whenever he has an issue with something, he goes out and corrects it in the offseason. He's a extremely hard worker, which is why he's gotten where he's gotten to in his career. I think we all know his story about, being benched in college and having to come back. But I think when you look at the 2022 season, one thing that a lot of people just overlook and take for granted is just how easy their schedule was. I think they played something like 3 top 10 defenses that year. And if you look at 2 of the top 10 defenses they played, one was the 49ers, one was the Cowboys. The first Cowboys game they played and then the 49ers game they played, they averaged like under 4 yards per play. So when they did play the elite defenses, they had some issues moving the ball. And so I think there were some signs that maybe not everything was perfect with the offense. Now they played so many, teams that they could just run all over that it masked a lot of some of the stuff that he needed to get better with. And then you get into the 2023 season, and like I prefaced already, they kind of ran back the same scheme because
Right.
why not? But then they play a much harder schedule, and then some of his issues come to light. Like he's not a guy, like his pocket presence needs to improve. For everything he's good at, he's a guy that does get he gets happy feet, he will scramble, he's really right now at his career, he's looking for his first option, second option, then scramble and see if he can make a play down the field later. He needs to get better with that, and I think he will. He's also a player that, for his entire career, he has been a guy that doesn't really like throwing over the middle of the field. Now, a lot of people will put that on the coaches and their scheme, and I think it's kind of one of the chicken and egg scenario, whereas are they not calling more plays to target the middle of the field because Jalen doesn't like throwing there? I think it kind of goes hand in hand. I think that's an area that Kellen Moore can help alleviate in his game or help elevate in his game. And Moore, when I go back and look at Moore's offenses in Dallas, like, he just made things so easy for his players, for his receivers, for his quarterbacks. Their use of motion, their use of stack and bunch formations to get clean releases. The Eagles didn't have any of that going on last year. It's pretty much go line up in a static formation. We run these plays out of these sets, these formations, and you got to go win one-on-one. And that makes things harder for your quarterback. And so I think Jalen, number one, is a hard worker, and I think he is going to we'll see improvement in that area. I don't think he's going to come in this season and have Tom Brady pocket presence all of a sudden, but I think we should see improvement in that area. But I think Kellen Moore should also help elevate him to that level as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at Kellen Moore, obviously he's moved teams the last couple of years from Dallas, and then he was in the Chargers. But I think kind of his downfall in Dallas would have to be that, like, things weren't working out. Mike McCarthy's also a guy who can call plays, and eventually the scapegoat comes when you don't get the job done. Obviously, he gets caught in a kind of a situation last year where Staley's on the way out. They're looking for a new regime. Harbaugh comes in. So it's not one of those situations where like you're getting an unproven guy. Like this is a guy who knows how to run a very good offense, and you're going to an offense with a good offensive line and a loaded weapon. So very excited to see kind of what the Eagles do on offense this year. I think it's going to be more of like a return to that 2022, 2023 form in terms of performance, not necessarily the way they run the offense.
Yeah, and you make a good point. You know, like the Chargers, his Chargers tenure was a little rocky, but if you go through and look at they between their first, second, third, and receiver and their tight end and Austin Eckler being out, they missed something like 33 total games combined between those players. Like I was watching the Kellen Moore offense, and at the end of the year, there's legitimately three receivers out there that I don't know who they are, and then Quentin Jefferson.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like what coach is really going to succeed at that point in time? And not to mention Herbert was dealing with injury for much of the year as well. It was kind of a tough deal for him. And at the end of the day, Keenan Allen, 31-year-old Keenan Allen, might have had his best season ever in terms of his efficiency, his statistics, it was either his efficiency or it was his total number of yards and
I
catches
think it was
that
yards,
were, yeah, amongst his career highs, and he did that at 30 or 31.
Yeah.
So it's like if he can do that for Keenan Allen, what is he going to do for Devontae Smith? And then going back to what you said about the Cowboys, I mean, absolutely, the biggest he was a scapegoat, like you said. They couldn't get it done. They had to scapegoat somebody. You think the head coach is going to scapegoat himself? No, he's going to blame it on the offensive coordinator. He's going to say we fired him because he doesn't run the ball enough, and then he's going to turn around the next year when they're blowing everyone out and throw the ball even more than Kellen Moore threw it. It just made no sense to me. But
yeah.
That is a great point. That actually is a great point. Now in hindsight, while we're still on the topic of offense, I definitely got to ask you about this one because obviously we know Saquon is going to have a big impact on this offense. But I guess the question is, how much of an impact do you think he's truly going to have? And give me more of a stat line prediction for this year for Saquon and this Eagles offense.
yeah, this is the time of the year where everyone wants to. We pump up our players so much and we set such high expectations for them, especially the new players. Like I had videos going back to this last offseason, and people were saying Nolan Smith was going to lead the Eagles in sacks. He was going to be the best edge rusher on the team by the end of the year. And I'm like, he's just going to overtake Hassan Reddick as a rookie. Like he's going to have more sacks in his first season in the NFL than he had in an entire college career. Like, but that's where we're at this point in the offseason, right? We're having fun. But I see a lot of people saying Saquon's going to get 2,000 rushing yards. I don't see it like that because I think guys that get 2,000 or that many rushing yards are usually playing for teams that don't have a lot else on your team. Like they're leaning on you because that's all they have. The Eagles are going to spread the ball around to a lot of players, and I think he's going to have his best efficiency metrics since the first two seasons of his Giants career before his ACL injury. Now, I don't think like I said, I don't think he's rushing for 2,000 yards. I think if I had to put a number on it, I think he's probably going to hit about 1,400. That's a little bit higher than what Miles Sanders hit when he was finally got a workhorse role for the Eagles. But I think they've come out and said in a recent press conference that like Kellen Moore came out and said, yeah, we're going to use Saquon, but we also understand that it's a long season. He's also a 27-year-old back, so he is on the older side. It takes a little bit longer to recover once you start, getting up there. It's funny to say about a 27-year-old, but
Right.
at a position so demanding like that, it's just something that happens, right? So I think they're going to be smart about using him. So I don't think they're going to overuse him. I think they're going to lean on some of their other backs. I think they're going to lean on the rest of their offense for some of the games, and then use Saquon in the high leverage. Like if they're going to give him a ton of touches, I think it'll be a more high leverage situations than, is he getting carries at the 50-yard line in the second quarter? I think we can save some touches there. So I think about probably 1,400 rushing yards. If I had to I didn't look at receiving yards. I'm going to guess he's probably around, I would say he's probably going to get somewhere between 50 to 60 catches. I know a lot of people think he's going to get 80 or so, but if you actually look at Kellen Moore's offenses, his percentage of targets to running back as a percentage of the offense is actually fairly low, but because they generally his offenses were heavier passing offenses, there was some higher target totals. But he understands that passing to running backs all the time isn't as efficient to passing to receivers and passing to tight ends. So I know a lot of people think he's going to bust out for this, crazy season, but he's in an offense where he doesn't have to carry the load. So he's going to be a huge benefit to it, but not the main driver of the offense.
No, I think you hit on a bunch of great points. And I think the one I actually want to, comment on and follow up on more than anything is where fans get ahead of themselves. Because and you guys are a team. Look, you guys are very much already, still sitting there. You guys are competing for the whole thing. And, from a coach's perspective, you want to keep the guys that are going to be really, really the big part of it. You want to keep them as healthy as long as possible. So, if you're, again, barring anything crazy, the Eagles are a playoff team. You guys are poised to go far in the playoffs. You want Saquon at his best in January and February. You don't want to just overload him, in the months where, again, not that it doesn't mean anything, but it means a lot less. I think that we'll see a fair amount, honestly, this year of Will Shipley. I don't know how you feel about Will Shipley. I think he'll kind of, get into that scat back role. He'll definitely get a fair amount of touches because more than anything, just keeping Saquon fresh for when it really matters, kind of mix things up.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. They are a team that has really Super Bowl aspirations, right? They've built their team that way. They've gone all in. They keep signing their biggest players or not. They've shown that this is a team that expects to compete. They expect to be in the playoffs, so you do got to save some hits for later in the season. And as far as the Will Shipley talk goes, I think it was more so they're preparing. Kenny Gainwell is off of his rookie contract after this year. I think this was more a move that, hey, we want to get this rookie back in the system now so that year 2, he's ready to fully take over that running back 2 situation. They like Kenny Gainwell, and I think he got a lot of hate last year from Eagles fans, especially because they came into the season. I'm going to drop a video soon about Shipley, and part of it's going to be talking about how everyone hates Gainwell now. But going into last season, there was a legitimate talk that he was going to be RB1. And then when you have people with expectations of way up here and you're not that, they kind of then tank your expectations. And listen, he's a solid running back too. He has the NFL experience. He knows pass protections, which if you're going to be a scat back, you got to be good at. And Will Shipley's not there as a pass blocker yet. That's going to be the biggest thing holding him back from really taking over that job. I think when it's all said and done, Will Shipley, in 4 years from now, I think Will Shipley will be a better running back than Kenny Gainwell was at this point in time. But I think it's going to be Gainwell is probably going to be the first back off the bench, and then Shipley will mix in a little bit.
I think that's a very level-headed take. It's a very level-headed way to look at it, especially because that's why I had to ask, is I know the Eagles fans have kind of just jumped ship on Gainwell. I had to see where your head is at on the whole situation.
Yeah, much more of I would say I try and look at things from both sides of the table. When it's game day and something happens and I'm like, get this guy off the goddamn field, but when I go back and I rewatch the film on Monday and I'm going through it and there's no emotions involved, I'm like, all right, this guy does serve a purpose. He isn't as bad as everyone says, and he's going to play a role this season. So
I think it's a great way to look at it.
Obviously, like, all those running backs are super dependent on how well their O-line moves. So what are you kind of expecting going into the year from the O-line after the departure of Jason Kelce? We know the Eagles kind of churn out, offensive, defensive linemen, but that is a Hall of Fame center that you are losing. So what do you kind of expect from, I guess, a little bit of a younger group?
Yeah, younger, but at the same time, you still have some
the vets,
entrenched veterans, so that does help with the transition. I think the thing about a center, like losing a center versus a guard, is the center is involved in so much of the communications. How much communication Kelce had with Jalen last year really took a lot off of Jalen's plate in terms of what he needed to do pre-snap. They work together on stuff, and Kelce has talked about this in interviews, and at the end of the day, it's Jalen's say. But to have a guy like that with that much experience that you can lean on to help you out, and 5 seconds are left on the play clock or the play clock, and you need to make a decision. It's great to have those guys that can really point things out and get everyone on the same page on the offensive line. So I think that's going to be the biggest question mark going into the season, is how do the Eagles handle that with presumably Cam Jurgens taking over at center? I think Cam's a good player, but that's going to be the biggest difference that we see. And does Jalen take on more of that responsibility next year, especially since he is going to be on what I think his 5th year now? So I think you would expect Jalen to take that on. But there is a bit of a domino effect. So not only do you have Kelce leaving, which moves Jurgens from guard back to center, you have a center you have a player who's playing center for the first time in the NFL, but then you now have to fill in what was Jurgens' spot last year with, I think it's probably going to be Tyler Steen.
Mm-hmm.
there's some question marks there about how that is going to work. But I think at the end of the day, with an offensive line coach as good as Stoutland, I think with the elite talent they have at three of the other positions, I think they'll be okay. Especially in Philadelphia, I know we love our offensive linemen so much, and we've kind of been built and understood that our identity is built through the offensive line. We kind of expect every player on the offensive line needs to be like a Pro Bowl or all pro caliber player when that's not necessarily the case. I don't know if you guys listen to Daniel Jeremiah's pod at
Yeah,
all, but
move the sticks.
at one point in the season they were going through, or after the season they were going through and seeing how do the best teams actually construct their offenses. And what was more important was to first, if you're going to have an offensive line, make sure you don't have any just horrible players on the offensive line. But really, you're looking for like three key players that you can build around on the offensive line, and the Eagles have that. You can kind of everything else out if you have a good foundation like that. So, do I expect the Eagles' offensive line to be as good as they have been in the past? Probably not, but I think they're still going to be one of the top offensive lines in the league.
Yeah, I remember. I think it was Daniel Jeremiah that said that, but it's better to have 5 like league average guys than to have like 2 really good guys and then a really bad player on the line, because
Oh yeah,
you just create a liability for everybody else on the line if someone is getting pressured every single time. So yeah, that definitely, I think as we get through the league more and teams start to look at that, it's more about just having a solid group than trying to have the best player at left guard, left tackle, that type of thing.
yeah, and especially like I think there can become a point in time where you overinvest in a certain area of your team where it kind of takes away from you building out the rest of your team, which kind of showed up last year in our defense. And to some degree, it's still showing up this year when you look at our linebacker core, still a question mark. But especially last year, they hadn't taken a corner earlier than the fourth. I think Sidney Jones was the last time they had taken a corner in the second round or earlier several years ago. And then since then, it had been like another 15 years before then since they had taken a corner in the second or first round, right? So, but that's because they were putting their resources into the offensive line. But I think you can overinvest sometimes.
No, especially in a group like the O-line. And while we're still on the topic of offense, before we go back to just a couple defensive questions that we have stashed away here, who do you think ends up taking wide receiver 3 on the depth chart by the start of the season? Because it's currently Devontae Parker. I don't know if you know this, but a little fun fact. Devontae Parker has been literally the least separating wide receiver in the entire league for the last I don't remember. It's 2 or 3 seasons. It's one of the two. Again, good at the catch point. He's good, high point kind of guy. But I don't know if I expect him to be your guys' wide receiver 3 by the start of the season, especially with the young talent you guys brought in. So it could be Devontae. Who are you thinking is going to be the guy that takes that wide receiver 3 role?
Well, I would put it this way. Our wide receiver 3 is Dallas Goedert. So I don't think wide receiver 3 is as big of a deal for the team as most people think, because even whoever's getting the fourth, Saquon's probably getting the 4th amount of targets after him anyways. Ultimately, what I think is going to happen is similar to what happened last year, is that they kind of rotate who is going to be receiver 3. I don't think it's going to be one entrenched player is going to play that. I think they brought in, interestingly enough, they brought in 2 slot guys and then 2 outside guys. So they brought in Devontae Parker and Johnny Wilson in the draft, who are going to be probably your outside X receivers. And then, because you got to think about Devontae and AJ both move inside too. They don't just exclusively line up outside. So it's not like they need just a slot receiver or just an outside guy. They can kind of mix or match. So they brought in 2 outside guys in Parker and Wilson to battle it out for, I think, what will be that kind of role. And then they bring in Paris Campbell and Anaya Smith to battle for that slot receiver role. I don't know who's going to win those jobs, but I will say this. I'm a huge Anaya Smith fan. I think he got pushed down the board because of, number one, his stature, probably the fact that he has had some injuries, or he had a major injury in 2022, and also the fact that this was such a deep receiver class that, I mean, there was really good players that were going in the 4th, 5th, even 6th round of the drafts, but that typically would have gone much higher, and I think can play roles in the NFL. Now about Anias, if I'm not going to say he's this player, don't get me wrong, but if you want to think about a play style of how he plays, he is very Amon Ra like in how he plays. He's a guy that wins inside over the middle with, first of all, he's got great hands. This past season, he had one of the lowest. Like if you look at PFF Ultimate, they have a stat on how many of your passes were catchable. And of those catchable passes, how many of them did you catch? He had one of the highest in the past 5 draft classes uh, of all the receivers that had been drafted. So his hands are very reliable, but he also catches over the middle, and he's extremely tough to not just catch the ball, but catch the ball through contact, knowing he's going to take a hit, but then he'll bounce off those hits. Or he's so good at finding a little spot in the middle of the zone, catch the ball, and immediately know that I have to dip to the left or to the right because I got a defender coming from this from this angle based on the coverage. He is extremely good after the catch. He was a punt returner for a reason. I mean, this guy's dynamic with the ball in his hands, but he's like that Amon-Ra type where he's very tough and physical. He breaks tackles. He's not a guy that goes down easily on contact despite his size. And on top of that, just to add to the Amon-Ra comparison a little bit, go back and see if you can find some of his earlier clips of him playing running back in college, and then watch Amon-Ra playing running back for the Lions. There's just some similarities in that aspect. So I really like Anias Smith because what you want from your receiver, especially a third receiver in this offense, you're getting limited targets. You need to do one of two things, and hopefully both. Be able to catch the ball. You just got to, you're getting checkdowns, you're getting underneath targets. You just got to be reliable catching the ball, which they didn't have with a number of their guys in the past. But when you do get the ball, can you make stuff happen and maximize the opportunities that you do get? And Anias Smith was really good at doing that in college. And I expect that I have a feeling that he's going to be, at the end of the season, the guy that you see playing the most out of the 4 players.
Well, you kind of answered my next question, so we can kind of skip that. I was going to ask who you were higher on, Smith or Wilson. But honestly, like, I love the versatility that the Eagles have in their pass catcher room. I've been big on Dallas Goedert for the last couple years. I think he is really one of the most underrated players at the tight end position. I just think because, you know, when you have 2 other kind of alpha receivers in the room, and it's not like a Chiefs situation where Kelsey is really their wide receiver 1. You have A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith there. So then you have a safety blanket in the middle with Goddard, and you just don't get talked about as much. Kind of going off of what you were talking about where the cornerbacks were not drafted highly by the Eagles in the past, now that you have Quinyon Mitchell, you have Cooper DeJean, I guess it's pronounced, not DeJean, I've been saying it wrong for months.
Yeah.
How do you think the situation will kind of look when the season starts in terms of their depth chart? Because I know the Eagles talked about keeping DeJean at that corner position and not safety.
Yeah, I mean, your guess is probably as good as mine. If we went into the season or into the off season, and after the first wave of free agency finished, you kind of looked at the roster and you're like, you know, did we necessarily address our biggest issues from the previous season? And we were kind of wondering, like, what's the future of this corner room? Because the narrative has been Howie Roseman doesn't draft corners in the first round. So what was the future going to be? And now coming out of the draft, it's like, well, we have too many corners on the team now. We're probably going to have to trade someone away, or hopefully trade someone away, but they're going to end up having to make some cuts that we probably didn't think they were going to have to make because they did go corner first and second in the draft. Now, in terms of who I think starting day one, I think Darius Slay's probably going to start day one. If I had to put money on it, I think Quinyon Mitchell's going to start day one opposite of him. I personally had Quinyon Mitchell as the best corner in the draft. There was, right before the draft started, me and my partner, we did a corner breakdown, and we discussed if there was any corner that we would trade up for to go and get in the draft. And the only one that we agreed on was Quinyon Mitchell. So I'm extremely happy that when they were sitting there on the clock and had the opportunity to choose him or Mitchell, that they went with, him and Tyrion Arnold, that they went with Mitchell. But listen, they're starting DeJean on the outside, which they should, because number one, Fangio's a zone, primarily a zone-based coach, or he runs a zone-based defense. Cooper DeJean is best in zone. I don't know if he had to go for a play for a team that runs a ton of man coverage. I don't know if he's necessarily that guy to play on the outside, but if he's a guy that you can have and he's very smart. He can read route combinations. He is very good reading the drop and the body language of quarterbacks to know what type of pass is coming. Is it a quick pass? Is it a deep pass? There was a play against Penn State where he doesn't even look at the receiver. All he's doing is reading the drop and the shoulder angle of the quarterback to know that, hey, he's about to take a deep shot, and then he runs the route for the receiver and gets an interception on the corner of the end zone. I think that's just a great play to highlight the instincts and the football IQ that DeJean has. So I think he can play on the outside in that type of system, and I think you're going to have your most value there playing as an outside corner. And even though we drafted Mitchell to first, do we know for sure he's going to beat out DeJean? I mean, DeJean's a good player too. What if DeJean comes? What if they flip-flopped him and got him wrong, and it turns out DeJean's the best outside corner? I don't think that's the case, but I think you start the battle there. Ultimately, I think DeJean moves inside before maybe transitioning to safety a little bit later in the season, or taking some safety snaps later in the season, or potentially next year, just because I think that DeJean's his full traits, his full strengths really are shown off when he is also allowed to play close to the line of scrimmage or use his physicality. That's negated to a degree if you're just having him play outside the entire time. He's a guy that can be a chess piece that you can move all around the field and be a playmaker. I think ultimately the future of this defense beyond this year, I could easily see it being Mitchell and DeJean as your base corners. And then when you go to sub packages, Keely Ringo being on the outside, I thought he showed some really good stuff in limited action last year. And then DeJean's kind of moving all over the place. So long term, I think that's something I can really get behind. Short term, I think that's what's gonna happen. But if Avonte Maddox stays healthy, Avonte Maddox could be the starting nickel corner first, second, and third down. Whereas I think if DeJean does play nickel this season, I think he'll be a lot more first and second down player, and then you might bring in Maddox as like your third down, a nickel corner.
Yeah, I just want to comment on one thing, Dobbs, and then I'll let you go with your question. I think what teams are doing kind of in a recent trend of double dipping at a position in the draft is really smart. Obviously going DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell, and then you see the Lions. They took Ennis Rakestraw. They took Terran Arnold. Last year, the Packers took 2 tight ends back to back. You know, the draft at the end of the day, we all know is a crapshoot. So why are you banking on, if you need to address this position, you're not putting it all on one guy to be that guy? Because how many times do we see fifth rounders outperform second or third rounders? It's less likely, but it happens more often than you think. So if you're going to take shots on a position that you know you need, it's best to double up. So I think that was a good strategy. And I think for the level of player that the Eagles got in DeJean at 40 is, I mean, you could argue that he could have been in the first if a team liked him enough. And he's just such a great athlete on top of that. You can really, if he doesn't work out a corner, you have another option at safety.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I'm arguing we should have gone first round. Because again, I don't know how you feel about him, Nick. I think you guys got an absolute hell of a player. Again, I'm with you where I do picture him transferring wherever he ends up. I think it will down the road be at safety. I think if you guys didn't bring back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson this offseason, I think that would have kind of already been where he was relegated to, because that's just where I see his strengths most. Like you said, in the run game, he's got it in a lot of areas, but not where his skill set is more like you nailed it, where you said he's more of a zone guy. Again, in man situations, he's a little bit more shaky than a lot of these other guys, but he's an absolute football player. There's no doubt about that. And I think you guys got yourselves definitely a stud. Getting him in the second round was crazy. Another defensive question I wanted to ask you, though, was, and we kind of already touched on him earlier, but we didn't go into this. Because, again, I know a lot of Eagles fans were very excited about him when you guys got him last year in the draft. Do you think that we can see a Nolan Smith breakout in this Vic Fangio defense? And if we did, what would we consider a breakout?
Well, so that's a good question. What do we consider a breakout? For me, because I think when you hear breakout, you hear, all right, this guy's going for double-digit sacks. I don't think that's happening. He was a raw player coming out of Georgia. If you look at just how many pass rush snaps he played coming out of Georgia compared to the 6 other edge rushers that were drafted in the first round, he played the second least amount of snaps. The next guy was Lucas Van Ness. but everyone else had played a significant amount more snaps than him, and you could tell in the film he just like didn't really have a pass rush game plan. Even his get off was very, I mean, he for such an explosive athlete, he didn't have that first step, get off the ball quickness that you would expect out of a player, and a lot of that came down to technique. But I don't think we're going to go from a guy that, listen, if you go back and look, just isolate the pressures he did get this season. I think he actually like beat a guy with a pass rush move one time this season out of like his 9 pressures that he got. I don't think we're going to see a guy go from that to all of a sudden is like, destroying people. But I think we can see him. I hope to see him take steps, and I expect to see him take steps. He's full. First of all, he's a hard worker. I think that's one of the big reasons that they drafted him. Was not only was he a great athlete, but he is a guy that is very committed from all accounts. And so those are guys that you can expect to take a step forward, and I expect that he will. But I think he does provide versatility for a Fangio defense because he does have the athleticism and ability to drop into coverage, and that's a very underrated part of what Fangio asks his edge rushers to do. It provides them a lot of versatility in their defense to bring pressure while also keeping 7 in coverage. And so by being able to have guys that are versatile enough to drop into coverage, that's a huge plus for him. I don't think he's going to be a guy that's I think he's going to be fighting for the guy that's third in snaps among the edge rushers. I don't think he's, maybe he comes out in the training camp and he's killing it, but I think it's going to be a gradual build with him, and then eventually probably a longer project. But once he figures it out, it's like, well, this guy has some traits and some tools to be really dangerous once he figures it out. But I just don't think he's a guy that's just going to boom flip the switch and all of a sudden is going to be night and day difference going into next season.
No, and again, I think that's just another very level-headed way to look at it. And I think you know this best. Like, we're in an era nowadays where people get a little bit too high on, combine numbers, pro day numbers. You got the youngins get seeing the Madden ratings. He's got 92 speed. How is he not gonna, be a freak off the edge? But like you're saying, a lot of guys come in, their projects more than anything. It's about honing the tools. But you guys definitely got yourself a real good, for a lack of a better term, you got yourself a really good piece of clay that you can really mold a lot of different ways. Now it's just on him to kind of make that jump. But definitely a lot of tools in the bag for Nolan. You guys just kind of got to hone in, and he's got to hone in himself.
Yeah, that 40 time really boosted his draft stock for sure. But I think it really should, a guy with that level of athleticism to fall to, I think it was the 31st or 30th pick of the draft. There's a reason why. It's because he was a raw player. And like you said, a lot of people just the easiest information for people to consume and then like interpret is combine measurements. Most people don't take the time to go through and sit in here and do the monotonous work of watching his plays and rewinding it and rewinding and rewinding it and seeing why this step, or he doesn't have his feet timed up with his hands and whatnot and all that stuff. So it's easiest to see, oh, this guy's really fast. He's going to be really good. And that's just not how, it matters, but not to people overemphasize that stuff.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It is definitely much different. Like you said, it's much different when you finally hit the film and you're taking it with no emotion. You just see it for what it really is.
Yeah.
So we've kind of gone through like the improvements that the Eagles have made this offseason, kind of their faults from last year, and kind of what prevented them from really, repeating what they had in that 2022-2023 season. So going into this year, I feel like Eagles fans may be a little bit more optimistic. I think Eagles fans are probably pretty high going into last year, but as the year kind of went on, everyone kind of saw there was some disjointedness and everything like that. So going into this year, what do you think is the ceiling and the floor for the Eagles?
Yeah, so I think the ceiling, it's, I sound like a douche saying this, but I think the ceiling is a legit Super Bowl run.
It is.
They have a stacked, especially offense, they're stacked. I think there's some question marks on defense to some degree. But you also compare that, the schedule just came out, and they are going to have one of the easier schedules. It's not the easiest in the league, but it's looking like they're going to have one of the easier schedules in the league this year. So they should have a bit of an easier path to get back to the playoffs and really be clicking on all cylinders when they get there. Unlike this year where they started the year, or this past year where they started the year hot, and then they hit this gauntlet of a schedule, and then all their confidence got diminished, and they couldn't fix it by the time the playoffs got around. So I do think that the ceiling is a legit Super Bowl run, but I do think the floor, and I'll put this, I think most likely they're probably, if I had to bet on it, they'll probably get to 10 to 12 wins. I know a lot of Eagles fans are right now, they're going, oh, look at this schedule. We're getting 14 wins easy, but that's just not how football works. I think the schedule is actually a little bit harder than what people are giving it credit for. And it's just hard to actually project how good these teams are going to be year over year in this league, especially with injuries. You never know what's going to happen. But along with that, I think the floor could be that they're assuming Jalen Hurts doesn't get hurt, I think they're a team that's probably a wild card team as the floor. I just think this team has too much talent to miss out on the playoffs, especially when you look at the rest of the division. I think maybe the Commanders got a little bit better, but I don't think the Giants really got better, and I think the Cowboys got worse. So I think they should at least be able to rack up some wins in their division to help them get to the playoffs as a wild card team if things did go wrong. There's some question marks, especially, first of all, we talked about offensive line. How is that going to work out? I think things will be okay. But what could end up happening is the bigger issue is the defensive side of the ball, where they may be playing a lot of really young players in their secondary. And on top of that, they didn't really, I don't know if they got better at linebacker, probably a little bit, because they were just horrible at linebacker last year, but that could be a downfall of their team. And that's really what unraveled the defense to a large degree last year, was just their linebacker play. They couldn't match up with running backs in the passing game. They were okay in the run game, but they didn't make impact plays, and you need to make impact plays in this league at some point, and they just weren't that good. So I think we could see a scenario where the Eagles offense really has to carry this team, and it's like the defense that's struggling a little bit. And you add to that is there's question marks. Is this Fangio scheme getting figured out by the league? Maybe this defense just really struggles, right? And if they end up as a wild card team or just missing the playoffs, I think it's because the defense struggled and the offense kind of had to carry them along the way.
Yeah, I mean, kind of going off, you're like overestimating the easiness of the schedule. I think when me and Dobbs, off-season content, we're doing our power rankings going into the year. We had a really hard time ranking some teams. Like, they're on paper, a lot of these teams could be pretty good, and obviously, any given Sunday, anybody can beat anybody. But this year, it just feels like so many teams upgraded and did the right thing in the draft and even free agency, that it's like no matter who you play, like their team got better. So it feels less like there's going to be easy wins. And obviously, as the year goes along, we'll start to see what team actually matches up with their offseason. But at the end of the day, even like some of the easier or worse teams in the league are still going to be competitive. Kind of like even if you look at the Cardinals last year, they were a 4-win team, but every game it felt like they were actually Eagles, competing. So. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not a person that takes any team lightly in the NFL. I know some people just look at the schedule and say this is an easy win.
Yeah.
It's just not how football works, especially professional sports. Like, these guys are a lot closer in talent than what I think most people think they are. Yeah. Like you said, it's any given Sunday. We really don't know how much of a step that players will take. And what if our players don't take that next step? We assume growth from our team, but we don't assume growth from other teams. That's just not how I think is the right way to approach it.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, you're spot on. And just another level-headed take. It's always the best way to look at it. And a great question here. We always ask everybody. I definitely am curious to hear yours. If you had to pinpoint your most memorable Eagles fan experience, what do you think? What's one that really stands out to you over the years? It could be recent, it could be old. Just give us your favorite Eagles memory.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it has to be winning the Super Bowl, obviously. But I was actually at that game, so that's for sure. I mean, I can never top that. Being at the Eagles' first Super Bowl victory ever, like I don't think it's hard to top that. But you know what? It was actually thinking about back to that day. It's actually pretty funny, just the whole story, even getting to the Super Bowl. So that year was in Minneapolis, and I live in Chicago. And
oh, no way. Me too. That's funny. Yeah. I didn't even know that.
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
That's raw.
Yeah. I'm finally happy that this weather is getting nice. Finally.
Yeah.
Middle of May, but so the Super Bowl was only like a 5-hour drive away. I had just gotten my bonus check from the first or fourth quarter of the previous year, like 2 days prior, and the Super Bowl is coming up, and my boss is like, he's like, at the end of the day on Friday, he's like, we're taking Super Bowl bets. He's a huge Tom Brady fan. He's like, we're taking Super Bowl bets. I got anyone who doesn't want to, who's voting, who's betting for the Eagles. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, just got this bonus check. I'm like, man, what if we just go to the Super Bowl? And it's like, I can't find anyone living in Chicago that's an Eagles fan that is going to pay money to go to the Super Bowl besides like an owner of a company. So he was like, yeah, let's go to the Super Bowl. So we end up, instead of investing in Bitcoin, which I should have done in 2018, I took that money and I spent it on a great experience. But the funny thing is, like, going through that weekend, like Saturday night, I'm hyped. I'm going to the Super Bowl tomorrow. It's going to be a great day. We're going to win it all. I end up staying out till 5 a.m. And my boss lives in he's the one that's driving me to the Super Bowl. He lives in an hour train ride north of the city. And so I have to get up and get to the train by like 8:30 in the morning, but I stayed up till 5. So I actually didn't wake up for my alarm clock. I, by the grace of God, somehow just woke up like 20 minutes before I had to be at the train station. I didn't shower. I didn't brush my teeth. I immediately got in an Uber and got on the train to make sure I got there. And then by the time I got to off the train and to his house, we're sitting there for like an hour. He's like introducing me to his family. He's showing me around his house. And like I'm smelling like a brewery, meeting his kids. And I'm like, dude, we got a 5-hour drive. We got to get the hell out of here. And he's like, what time's the game at? And I'm like, it's like at 5:30, something like that. He's like, oh, I thought these late games usually come on at 7 or 8.
No
I'm like, no, we got to
way.
get the hell out of here. But it gets better. So we finally get out of the house and we're making our way up to Minneapolis. And probably the first 3 hours of the ride are going pretty well. And then it starts to snow on us. And so, we start slowing down, but then we hit like a roadblock. Like traffic isn't moving. And obviously there's an accident somewhere, but we're sitting there for like 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I don't know how long. But then my boss is like, all right, screw this. He reverses. He gets out of the highway and reverses to the next exit you could find, which is like a mile down the street. So we're going like backwards a mile just to find the next exit so we could find another route to get to Minneapolis. So then we end up getting there finally. And when we get to the place where we had bought parking tickets for, there's like the game is about to start. We're like the last people pulling up for the Super Bowl. So there's no parking lot attendant. So we're now sitting in the parking lot for like another 20 minutes, just trying to figure out if this is the right spot to even park. So my boss's car doesn't get towed so we can get out of this place because we didn't get hotels. We just drove back after the game. And so we finally pay, find where we're supposed to go. We get into the stadium and we miss kickoff, which I really wanted to see kickoff because you get all the flashing lights for the Super Bowl. But it's all right. I had a great time rooting on, watching probably the best Super Bowl, one of the best Super Bowls ever. So at the end of the day, that whole journey of almost missing it was worth it. So,
Bro,
well, it was a fantastic story. I have one last question. I'm curious, and I'm already thinking ahead. What was the car ride like home then? Because it was your squad who took the dub and his squad took the L. What was that car ride like?
Well, for me, I slept. I mean, I was working off like 3 hours of sleep. So to me, it was like, I remember falling asleep, but I was like, man, finally a champion.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, mission accomplished. But it was actually funny. So he's a Brady fan. He's like, he loves the GOAT. So he loves Michael Jordan. He loves Tom Brady. So he thought we were going to watch Tom Brady. And I'm sitting there like cheering every time the Eagles do something, right? But he doesn't know I'm an Eagles fan. And he especially doesn't know because the shirt I was wearing, I wasn't wearing a jersey. I wasn't wearing a shirt that said Eagles. I don't know. That was the year where they were underdogs going into the playoffs because Nick Foles was their backup quarterback was starting and they wore all those dog masks.
Yeah.
And so that ended up making it on the shirt of underdog. So I just have this German Shepherd shirt on and I keep rooting for the Eagles. So he's like, why the hell are you rooting for the Eagles? I thought we were rooting for Brady. I'm like, no, bro, this is a Eagles shirt. So he didn't even know I was an Eagles fan halfway through the game. So.
This is an even crazier plot twist, bro. This is actually an amazing story.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can repeat this year in New Orleans. I nothing against Minneapolis, but I feel like New Orleans is probably a better party town, and I'll probably stay for an extra couple of days if it happens this time.
I'll tell you, somebody who's been down there. I as a Saints fan, I'll tell you, you definitely, if you guys can pull it off in New Orleans, you guys will have yourself a fantastic time down there, bro.
Oh yeah.
I don't know how you weren't bugging out missing the kickoff. Like, I know you were probably like so like internally like, oh, I have to be here, because even when I went to the Bears Panthers last year, the tickets were like $50. I'm like, fuck it, I'll go. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm about to miss kickoff. I'm like, oh my Lord. Like, getting into Soldier is a nightmare, but it's just like
Yeah, it's a. I mean, living in Chicago, I've been there. That walk is horrible.
brutal.
Why?
Brutal.
And then there's no tailgating area. I mean, it's like a very small, but like when I go to Eagles games, it's like an event. People are
Yeah.
there to tailgate. And Bears games, it's like you got to walk a mile to get to the stadium. It's
Well,
like it's
that's why
it
when
kinda
they're
takes
talking about the
edge off.
new stadium, I'm like, I wanted to be in Arlington Heights. I've been to the Colts Stadium, and I went to another game. I can't remember, or Tampa Bay. It's just like, this is what a football game is supposed to be. Like, we're missing so much keeping the stadium here. You don't even own it. But anyway, this is not Bears talk. This is Eagles talk. So thank you so much, Nick, for hopping on. Do you want to let people know where they can find you?
Yeah, so you can find me my YouTube channel. That's where I'm most active, and you're going to get the most insightful, insightful analysis from me. I would recommend. We have multiple different types of content. I do some conversations like we're having here today, but I also do in-depth, like nitty-gritty, detailed breakdowns that only like nerds like to watch. But I'd recommend checking out. I have a Bryce Huff video, which would be he's my favorite move of the offseason for them was getting Bryce Huff. I would check that video out to kind of get a taste of that conversation. And then you can check out some of our longer form podcasts that we've put out as well. But that's at Philly Film Room is the channel on YouTube. And then you can find me on Twitter at Philly_films.
That'll be in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, if you don't know ball and want to know ball, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, let us know in the comments what you think the Eagles record will be this year. We hope you have a great rest of your night.